don't want to be too harsh and critical on Evan's uh, system of navigation through these matters, as I think that there are good categories, good containers to kind of contend with these issues and look at it is a good framework to perhaps judge particular forms of phenomenological self inquiry. But I'm going to be critical of Evan's. I mean, obviously, perhaps this is slightly unfair because he's not fully developing it. But I'm going to make some important notes, I think, on virtualism. That in some sense, I want to partially refute Evan's conceptualization of virtualism, or at least point to something um, that I think unlocks what is being somewhat confected into Evan's presentation, which is something like the scientific paradigm, which in some sense is even resolved in the later discussion and in Evan talking about technology. Because okay, so maybe I should just touch on that immediately now that I've just named it. But yeah, and I'm going to perhaps answer the question as to what a better form of phenomenological self inquiry, where a more fertile ground is in terms of looking at that, which is, I guess, only made possible because of let's say Evan creating this framework for me to even make comments within or something like that. So the problem with virtualism, in some sense, is that it is hanging on the scientific narrative and paradigm, and you can say that well that's maybe that's Evans Metis himself, but and I am sensitive to that, but let me just make the critique anyway. Is that the this recording would be much better with slides and things like that, but basically you have to understand that, and Evan somewhat admits this as well on a technical sort of level, but I'll just I think have a better way of capturing it by just talking about it, I think, intelligently, that on some level, mind and reality in Evan's description of virtualism is a false dichotomy, at least in relation to um, the self, because calling it an organism in some sense grounds it in some description, but essentially the boundary of mind within a greater reality, which is basically a form of materialism. Now, so in some sense, when this whole then virtual system is hinged on the narrative of scientific materialism or temporal determinism or all these sorts of things, which are even not themselves grounded within science. So it's grounded within Newtonian science if it's grounded in anything. And so, already there is this weird way in which I guess you could say science has this false dichotomy within itself, which is either if you go to the subatomic level, it's spooky. Let me just say that it's spooky. Causation becomes a spooky phenomena. It's weird. And if you're doing something else, then that's something that a decision making, phenomenological decision making, technological picture of the process is just as good as chemistry in some sense. That if you can understand that chemistry is just another form of culinary art, it's just another form of a cookbook and recipes and formulas. That there's nothing intrinsically true about chemistry other than it's a proven recipe book that the technology is workable, right? So techne and technology and science, these things get convoluted quite badly in the Western, let's say, pretentious groping for a narrative that grounds everything in a kind of in an objective external reality or something like that. But in some sense, we and I think this door is somewhat left open in Evan's presentation, perhaps even explicitly, that we can see from the phenomenological side of things, from the self side of things, that you can take them both as a whole, and sometimes you have to take them both as a whole, But I mean, obviously, some people might have problems in one or the other, more so that kind of make the dichotomy or that division between mind and reality. But in some sense, I would just say that we can create workable technologies to deal with both of those together. And in some sense, I would even say philosophically, this was worked out by Aristotle's agent causation. That we can understand that the rock is moved by a staff, and the staff is moved by a hand, and obviously, in some sense, the muscles in the hand, the electrical signals being sent to those muscles. But what is moving that? That is the self. So it all, the driver of the technology is always something that it is at least intimately connected with phenomenological self inquiry, at least in if you're going to have reasons for your actions, if you're going to have decisions behind your will, your manifested expression of action, that we can only know or understand in conjunction with the self, which is not the same thing as the mind or the reality, but is in some sense needs at least to be relatable enough to mind and reality to eclipse whatever obstacles that false dichotomy might be concocted, and so in some sense, the idea that sort of science is a kind of is a simple way of saying, well that's the obstacle of materialism that we would that we should learn about, because then we would be able to have a knowledgeable resource well enough to overcome problems. Well, how about the real problems that we have, which are more from the phenomenological side of things, because in some sense they're about the use of those things. I mean, like, the arms race in terms of developing, I mean, the science that existed that created the atom bomb, we've gone further than that in terms of science and scientific thinking. So in some sense, it's not the knowledge, it's not the atoms themselves, it's how they are being engaged in by actual individual phenomenological self-inquiry or something like that. So you can even see that the phenomenological self-inquiry is in some sense the ruler of the mind reality substrate or whatever. And the idea that it's all atomistically sort of founded in the one rather than the other, I mean, I think that you have to almost say that all power is on the side of the self and not in terms of the mind and reality even. That all efficacy even is there. And even, this is not understood within the scientific method, but essentially without an agent there using the method, it's just a method, it's not reality. So, it's somewhat confusing the map with the territory. And these things can only be mapped from the phenomenological side of things, the phenomenological world. Anyway, so in some sense, I think that we can combine mind and reality into the confluence that is workable technology. And therefore we can understand that all of it, all the narratives that we might make out of mind or reality or one or just reality, they're arbitrary. They're not in fact true. And this, you can only sort of overcome that arbitrariness by saying, well, physics has the answer. Within physics, there's going to be a single objective reality that we're going to derive from that. And I would argue that that's already been invalidated by the understanding of subatomic phenomena and quantum mechanics. I don't think that that's justifiable. I think that then we would even see that these things are more closely related, again, to the phenomenological side of things. Just because you can kill my brain and then kill me and stop my incarnation in the so-called reality, again, I think that you would give an account of these things on the phenomenological world, not in the that doesn't prove your case that the substrate of reality of Newtonian physics rules the day. So there is a dualism between mind and reality, and that dualism, I think, is in some sense navigated by technology. And in some sense, the technology of using science as a canonical narrative is itself a very limiting one, and that's what I'm warning about in terms of Evans' virtualism. And maybe it's just made to be a step. Maybe by design, it's even a kind of trickery that it's designed to be a stepping stone to wean people off of being plugged into a kind of narrative matrix, because they need to. The problem is that when you have this kind of dissolution of agency within the kind of the application of a narrative like this, you end up doubling down things like I mean there are things in what Evans say which which speaks horribly to me of some of the kind of problems that you get in Orthodox Christianity or traditional Christianity, or the kind of the stupid Christianity, that, for instance, almost judging people based on how productive in the world they are. And the idea that you can get some kind of firm reading on that, when that is perhaps itself not the the idea that there's a kind of that there's an emergent transcendent meta narrative is something that becomes very poisonous when you think that it's just owned by a single person and not by the collective themselves. The idea that there's no such thing as martyrdom, for instance. So that there isn't a metis in martyrdom or something like that. And someone perhaps doing the hard work of, in some sense, seemingly appearing to be a demon of some kind is the opportunity of a beta synthesis or something like that. Anyway, so I guess I'm speaking to both of these potentialities and tendencies, which Evan even explicitly explored, which is quite interesting. But yeah, essentially the only way that that Evans virtualism, you see, so I'm complaining that the model itself is deficient, but that I'm still saying that it's a useful model in some sense. But in terms of seeing the mystery within sort of the core problem of it, or something like that, that essentially it's all based on the idea that science has. I mean, if you want to root everything within science, then you have to really understand that science has this mixed up, fundamentally self-contradictory sort of nature, then, that it's both spooky and it's deterministic. And because then it's already sort of, the greatest value devaluing itself, and everything else built on top of that, you can just say, oh, well, we need to understand science more. You can always just defer, okay, well, the reason why you in particular are causing a problem in our midst is because you're not a productive person, because you're not on the same narrative. You're not building with us on top of the same story. And there's no other grounding or something like that. But anyway, so I mean, this can also be the problem with the Omega rule. Essentially, I would say that the Omega rule is a protocol of first contact. But in some sense, I mean, the problem with this virtualism, in some sense, is that it kind of binds all the mystery into a subject, which then some experts can rule over as false authorities, when it really belongs in the phenomenological self-inquiry side, or the phenomenological world, between that and the self. Now, and in some sense, I think that the mind-reality thing is the narrative that we all have to be sensitive that we still have, that there are we have unconscious holds of those forms of narratives. I'm using it as a category of unconsciousness, and I do think that you do need to have a phenomenological, so I mean, okay, so anyway, I think I've kind of talked about the toxicity around this, although perhaps not that definitively. But let me just talk about what a more stable kind of phenomenological self-inquiry would entail. And this is my opinion, I guess, and perhaps there can be a better method. I'm not wedded to this, but anyway. So I guess take it from another subjective observer about this. But I would say that cognitive functions are the best, because cognitive functions, in some sense, are the combination of mind and reality, and in some sense, you could say that they're grounded within psychology. And if you understand, let's say, the problem in science, in terms of materialistic sort of hard science, supposedly, it's all in some sense grounded on the fact that psychology could never get its act together, or something like that. Something like, because of the poverty in psychology, philosophy can always just be said to be a kind of controversial mess, and nothing can ever happen there, because you just have these differing schools of irreconcilable disagreement. Especially, let's just say, in the case of moral philosophy, which is perhaps a more important, that cognitive functions, the Jungian conception of cognitive functions, introverted feeling, extroverted feeling, introverted thinking, extroverted thinking, introverted intuition, extroverted intuition, introverted sensing, extroverted sensing, give you a complete, in principle, they give you a complete set of ways in which that mind and reality and the phenomenological world and the self can cohabitate a kind of a single simplex paradigm. Now, I mean, I'll go deep into, I mean, look, cognitive functions were essentially derived by Jung through a kind of alchemical process, from a kind of Platonic alchemy. And so the Platonic metaphysics of the divided line and such, I don't want to go into it, because I have my own deep theory of mind and model of psychology, which has, I also use the 8 Jungian cognitive functions to describe what I think is at the core of them, which is essentially the idea that there are realms of prepositional spheres of operation. And that they have a particular hierarchy or a particular way in which they interrelate to one another, in which that they fit in within one another like Russian dolls. But this is a bit of a tangent. But I do think that is basically a kind of that I consider to actually be the true roots of psychology. So I do think that I have actually, within my research, I have actually founded real psychology, and also there are models within it which are very reminiscent uh, quantum mechanics and stuff like that. So I do think that my psychological models are deep enough to actually explain a phenomenological grounding of even science, that to raise psychology to be the queen of the sciences, um, which still needs the agent to to operate technologically within that system of structure. That, you know, the inert understanding of things at the end of the day will, even always to the end, to the agent, will just be merely a narrative. And in some sense, the good faith that they have, or the charity that they have to utilize such a narrative, is interesting. I mean, I would say that there's a deep reverence of that within my models themselves, at the deepest level. But anyway, or I should say, on the most esoteric level, not on. Anyway, my deep theory of mind is very interesting. It's kind of like I mean, anyway, I could metaphorically expand it in many different directions, but anyway, and it has huge correspondences with many religious symbols and many religious systems and throughout history, but that's not so important. But so, although when you're talking to people in the typology community that talk about Jungian cognitive functions, I'll just talk about some models that I consider to be very close to my models of psychology. The Four Sides of the Mind, which is, as far as I know, mostly proselytized in public by C.S. Joseph. He has somewhat made popular the Four Sides of the Mind model of the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, MBTI. I don't endorse MBTI, but it is the closest thing to my theory. I don't endorse the structure of MBTI personality types, but when I go into my own model of personality, um, I even use a lot of the same jargon just as a bridge from people that already know that kind of psychology. But let me just say that the cognitive functions themselves are such a useful tool, because even in some sense, because I would say that they're imprecise, but they're even in their imprecision, because in some sense I have 17 cognitive functions. There are only 8 Jungian cognitive functions, but essentially then the difference between my model and Jung, apart from the actual structure in which these things are contended in my model, um, is that, for example, there are 3 types of extroverted feeling. Um, there are 2 types of introverted feeling. There are 2 types of introverted intuition, and you could still intuit that within the use of Jungian cognitive functions. If you try to canonically define each of these things and the characteristics of each of these things, sadly, I think that people are fundamentally misled, because the structure of their personality styles within MBTI structures are just too approximate. They're pretty good, but they're just a bit too sloppy, and so people end up conflating cognitive functions, because the role of one cognitive function in a particular slot within a personality structure is already just dogmatically understood to be this particular function. And so you're kind of misreading the function on purpose, or you have to, if you want to pigeonhole yourself into having a type. So that is the problem with MBTI, and that's also why it has been academically sidestepped. But the problem with, for example, Big Five is that in some sense, Big Five is trying to understand cognitive functions and discover them psychometrically, is to sort of try to create statistical proofs of traits that would end up being something like cognitive functions. And in some sense, I mean, I don't necessarily fault them, because maybe all of that research might be useful in somewhat, uh, I don't know, how to, qualitative psychology. It might be used to even um, confirm some of my theory or something like that. But that would, um, but it would be much better just to independently work out psychometric tests to falsify my theory in psychology. But anyway, or my theories and my models. But I guess one of the issues is the problem in psychology is that they don't give themselves enough leeway to develop a sophisticated theory. Their theoretical models are not nearly as sophisticated as they need to be to come up against the kind of nature of the problem, the nature of the puzzle that it is. And because they want to try to only find it incrementally so that they can prove that they've used the scientific method, the basic problem is that essentially science can never, or psychology can never be a science because of the nature of consciousness itself. Psychology has to be grounded more in philosophy than in science, and then it can be experimentally, uh, well, there's no such thing as experimental verification, but at least it can seemingly pass falsification. Um, but that would even have to have, I don't know how to phrase this so delicately, but even that would have to have, let's say, a qualitative predictive force over describing the scientific method itself. And I mean, I can describe why the scientific method is fundamentally deficient, intellectually speaking, um, just by talking about cognitive functions. I mean, it's an introverted thinking cult. It's the false idea that introverted thinking tells you if something is incorrect or correct rather than just self-consistent. And in some sense, you could say, well, everyone should know this anyway, that obviously science doesn't verify anything. It just tentatively falsifies it. Um, and I do mean that. I didn't misspeak there when I said it tentatively falsifies it. Because the things that it falsifies within the context of the scientific narrative or the scientific methodology. And when was that ever verified? When was that ever proven to be the equivalent of empiricalism or empiricism? I would argue the only real empiricism is phenomenology. And then obviously that's not a falsification, but then you're in the realm of deduction, and people don't even realize the extent to which Newton screwed everything up so badly in terms of the actual understanding of the field. Um, that you think that if you can model something, that you've explained it rather than just described it. And then you get this hideous concoction, the idea that in the science of psychology, that if you can describe something well enough, then you can generate a kind of false authority around it, enough that you can diagnose and prescribe and give expert testimony in a legal framework. So many moral lines have been crossed, uh, all because of the false authority that the scientific narrative has been culturally uh, loaded with. The idea that sort of we've got a label for one of these things between reality, mind, and all these things, that, oh, well, reality is a materialistic sort of investigation. it's not even true. Not even according to, science has functionally invalidated itself. The idea that statistics, I mean, how can you falsify a statistical model? You can always just say, well, the sample size wasn't good enough. So you just keep on going until you confirm it. I mean, that you're outside the frame of science at that point. This idea that science is basically statistical mathematics, that reality then is therefore statistical mathematics at its core, or something like that. I mean, this is an embarrassing tautology. That's fallacious thinking. I mean, it's profane to the human understanding, and then it's just, oh, well, you have to understand humans can't understand it because science is better than humans. That kind of misanthropic bullshit. Just so that you can keep your narrative, essentially. So you could say that you've got a piece of the puzzle, so that it's better than nothing, or something like that. And this has been baked into then the whole sort of spiritual quest quite disgustingly. And it's uncoverable when you start to understand that, the kind of the mind reality false dichotomy, or some kind of dualistic narrative, that it will always be. I mean, well, there's a word for this in my spiritual tradition that I use in my phenomenological self-inquiry, which is just that it is the world. And you live in the world. And that is also the same story, is that you live in the phenomenological world, but that's because you don't have recourse to another narrative. You don't have recourse to another frame. If you do, then you're just basically buying into the propaganda of false authority. And I mean, in some sense, I do think that you do need an objective piece of the puzzle, and that objective piece in the puzzle is an emergent piece of the puzzle, which I call objective morality, which is emergent from a kind of enlightened subjectivism. And just because objective morality is something that is emergently contended into being, I mean, I'll make available some papers that are really worth reading on epistemic responsibilism and on living with nihilism, which is a chapter. The first thing that I mentioned was a paper by Catherine Elgin, but the second thing that I mentioned is a chapter by Vasti Root, which I think is actually the correct synthesis of Nietzschean nihilism, that actually finishes the whole philosophical schema with a kind of tentative solution, which is in some sense probably a better formulation of the Omega principle, because it doesn't bake in a kind of half-baked nihilism in which, well, it's all just meta-fluidity upon meta-fluidity, and sort of different pools of kind of the idea that there is actually an objective moral framework that this ends up comporting into. But it's not emanated from the outside. It's agentically underwritten. It's made real, but that reality, the objectivity of the merit of it, of its internal efficacy, that's in some sense a kind of a private contention but it is also a private contention that can be shared and duplicated and respected and understood, and then it makes our communication authentic and genuine, rather than just a kind of supported by some kind of materialist, hypothetical, sort of substrate or something like that, rather than that is just a technological workable model which is meant to be eclipsed by something that is more precious within the discovery of a phenomenological self-inquiry, that it is recollected in the Aristotelian sense of true wisdom. But in some sense, as Mark Passio, I'll quote him, if you were never on the path that there was a truth to attain to, a truth in faith, a truth in a transcendent truth, then you can't find it because you don't think you can reach it. If you think that philosophy is just an arbitrary afterthought to something that physicists are doing, if you think that the one comes before the other, I mean, you're not capable of getting anywhere. I mean, your phenomenological self-inquiry is, by your own framework, fundamentally a kind of masturbatory exercise and pursuit. The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, but what is God is the more important question than whether he exists or not, or what is it. I just misspoke. But what is God? Arguing whether or not it exists or not after is somewhat moot unless you first have an idea of what is it. Is it an it? I mean, in some sense, I think it can't. It's not. Well, yeah, it can't be an it. I mean, Paul van der Klee goes into this quite. It can't be a super thing. But righteousness, light, the light of reason, the light of consciousness, love. Anyway, I mean, this is devolving into sort of Christian sort of stuff, but uncovering the nature of the light of consciousness, the nature of the light of reason, that reason in the mind, understanding in the mind, is phenomenologically the light. And that was the thing that was actively created in Genesis chapter 1. But anyway, this is getting into testimony, but and essentially I would say that light is introverted feeling, fundamentally. That in introverted feeling is in principle good. It is in principle correct in a moral sense. That something has enough goodness in it that it can grow into something living, and it can produce a fruit that can reproduce its way of life, that can reproduce all of its workings, that has the seed of itself within it, the seed of the tree that bears the fruit within the seed of the fruit. It comes full circle. it's good enough to do that. It really, the thing that we have to contend with is, I mean, what is even called weirdly the love of the darkness. That man loves the darkness, and what is man? Man, I would say, is some kind of narrative about a reality. That conforming to a narrative about a reality, that you are going to instead love the darkness rather than the light. And to love the light, I mean, that's almost like, well, that is itself, to love God. I mean, that's a hard concept, because you can say, well, maybe it's just as illogical as a double negative or something like that. And hypothetically, according to a narrative, you can make that kind of reductive generalization. Because a negative number multiplied by a negative number is a positive number, just as a positive number of the same magnitude multiplied by a positive number of the same magnitude uh, to the first set of negative um, arithmetic is gives you the same positive number in multiplication. That's the problem with narrative thinking, is that it doesn't have discerning. It doesn't have a particular discerning that is peculiar to its embodiment. And that is the kind of conflation which is part and parcel of people who are jumping the gun, but also that essentially they're using introverted thinking, which is just a measure of self-consistency, and they are entrenching themselves and militantly creating a Tower of Babel in introverted thinking. They're creating a cult of TI. Let's just fudge ourselves into this narrative, into this process, and we'll just bake it into the sandcastle, and then we'll say that it's a real castle that has real sovereignty about it. These kinds of pretenders are people that want to achieve some kind of sovereignty, but there's something very important about sovereignty, which is not often, I think, explored enough, which is the royal we, the peerage. What is a sovereignty that can't justify the sovereignty of its peers? That can't defend or understand the sovereignty of its peers in their own understanding? Do they not have a justified understanding about what sovereignty is, but they wish to share in it with others? Well, then what is it? Has it not devalued itself then? Loving the darkness. To love, to not understand. Bootstrapping the effect and not taking responsibility for the cause of these things. Another way of loving the darkness. As you can say, all this is all resolved by phenomenological self-inquiry. I would say that if we do not convict each other to justify claims in our own understanding, then you do end up with essentially with a sovereignty that does not know the word authority, that does not know the word justification. And if you just throw away those words out of your lexicon and say, well, they're covered by our narrative, the narrative that we share, we're all justified by that narrative. You can't defend it on the level of the individual. At least you can't find one person to defend it on the level of the individual. So, I mean, I'm sensitive to pedagogical, let's say, forms of perhaps trickery or something like that. As bridges, perhaps. But there is a very sinister kind of leaven, which, if it's not at some point self-identified, and you can't actually move from the mother's milk of some kind of robotic use of rule omega into a principled understanding that you take personal responsibility for, I guess I was going to make a comment about the Sangha as well. I think it's very important to develop. I mean, I'm very much. This is what I think real Taoism is. Is that, first of all, you're not even taught unless you think you have an explanation for everything and you think you understand. So you have a perfected subconscious, you have a perfected belief system, you have a perfected kegan stage2, and they won't even talk to you until you've done that, till your bowl is full and it's complete, and then they break it in front of you, and then you have to build it yourself, and then as you're building it yourself, they'll break it down some more, and they'll chide you until you work out how to bootstrap your own understanding within some understanding of the measure of what's up against you in the problem of being, in some sense. And I would even say that the real masters are not the ones who graduate. I mean, do you really want to get in the Oxford system? If you get more than 50%, you pass, or if you get 50%, you pass in the Oxford system of being marked. So my remarks are in reference to that. But in some sense, maybe 50% is the right mark to get on some subjects because of the toxicity of the subject. that you can give yourself 100% as you got 50%. Maybe that's the right mark to get in certain history courses, in certain politics courses. Although, actually, I think in a non-corrupt political course, one that wasn't prone to ideological corruption, you would perhaps expect a higher mark from that in terms of being a thoughtful contrarian. But anyway, that's maybe a bit of a strange metaphor, but what's the point here? Is that the Sangha is a way to see other people as a reflection of another path that you could have taken and another set of experiences. And I do think that in that way Sangha is important, but that it is a source of guidance, but it is not a direct source of guidance. It is not a direct purveyorship for guidance. That guidance can only be indirectly self-processed by hopefully a burgeoning self-responsibility. I mean, in some sense, when you have a spiritual master, they are somewhat bound, duty bound, I would say, to get you to the point at which that you can chew your solids and digest and swallow and process from your own self-responsibility, and to perhaps have some seniority, but in some sense then to guide not by stricture, um, but by suggestion. Anyway, but yeah, so I mean, I guess, sorry, I get into a broad meditation on some of these issues when I'm actually talking about cognitive functions and their usefulness in philosophizing about all of these sorts of aspects. And in some sense, that already, you have to have the confidence that you can just kind of do that. And I mean, essentially, you can get the whole of science inside of cognitive functions. You could say, well, the whole of science is a module within introverted thinking and models of extroverted thinking. That's what science is. And then, and to actually know the geniuses of people that use extroverted thinking, then, and the creativity that they have, which has nothing to do with science, has their ability to model models within science, and then know actually how to ground them in some kind of principled. I mean, in some sense, aren't these are metaphorically how you could ground them in different systems of principle, and how you could relate. This is how Newton has an apple falls from a tree, or this is an allegory maybe, but or what's the other word? But anyway, if it's apocryphal or not, or whatever. But in some sense, that kind of synthesis of integration within a model, is that is where real empiricalism is. It's within phenomenological self-inquiry. That's where the real scientific method is, and you are a stream of thinking. This is a thing that I didn't understand anything about what Evan was talking about. The idea to get out of the habit that you are a thinker of thoughts, or that you're not thinking, so that you believe in this canonical view of that there is a mind and a reality as the base narrative. Didn't get that at all. I mean, that's. I mean, why can't the thinking? I mean, in some sense, the active process of thinking does break the dualism there between reality and mind. So in some sense, the only thing that it does is that it upsets the narrative, the scientific narrative, that the rest of the virtualism was sort of hanging on. Because perhaps it makes an uncomfortable link between materialism and the more spooky stuff as well. Is sort of that dogma then perhaps gets unraveled slightly, or threatened. But if you see yourself as a thinking self, then I don't see, and that thinking self is the eclipse of the mind. With some kind of technological bootstrapping, but I would say that it is better understood rather than mind as itself a kind of technological substrate within the phenomenological world. And in some sense, I think that's where all the conceptual notions, I mean, in some sense, this idea that linguistics itself has a kind of indexical, veritable foundation that is linked in science, So I mean, it's so. I do think the whole virtualism thing has so many holes in it from so many different angles. I mean, it's just pathetic, The idea, well, because how can it even linguistically ground itself? How can physics linguistically ground itself? It can't. I mean, that question was even open there in Evan's presentation. So, it's sort of it's a model that needs to be transcended within itself, or it needs to be reorientated or reprioritized within itself, quite starkly, just to stop itself from being embarrassing, just to get away from this kind of. I mean, in some sense, it disguises all of its irrationality by just saying, well, we can firmly have our feet on science. That science is is the cornerstone. And therefore, well, if you're not being productive in the world, then, we can falsify what you are thinking about, which is not workable, or which is causing you your unsuccessfulness. And when that is your formula for truth in the scientific narrative, yeah, I mean, that is a very dangerous form of sort of maniacal, mechanical reductionism that at its core doesn't even have the capacity, or it sacrifices its own discerning. And when it does that, it sacrifices its own sovereignty. Then it makes it prone to this kind of disgusting narrative, or table thump narrative, this gainsayed narrative. Well, because without that, then we can't have a virtualism that functions anymore, and then we don't have a bridge to get here. But yeah, I do think that essentially the bridge does start with a false bridge, as I even described in the Taoistic tradition. That people won't even train you or teach you anything in the Taoistic tradition until you've got an explanation for everything. But that explanation is something like your own science, is something like your own complete descriptive narrative, and then it'll just kind of usually it'll bootstrap itself, or there's no alternative. And that is true. That is the formula of the subconscious. And you have to kind of run that. You have to build your Tower of Babel before you realize that it's not going to make it. It's not going to reach the heavens. And a lot of people, that's how they build their Tower of Babel. And they know that it didn't reach the heavens, but they, it's another example, and it is useful, I would say, to have that exercise. And essentially, it all is based on the destruction of meaning and language itself. Because when you start, you end up having to lose the word justification. And yeah, this is the problem with what I see in Evan's presentation, is that it fundamentally only functions as an orthodoxy. And in that way, it's somewhat dangerous. That it's got this narrative installed inside of it. And without that module, it's anyway. So I guess what I'm talking about is, I guess, some soft ways of talking about the, let's say, the beginning of phenomenological self-inquiry, which in alchemy would be called negatio, essentially. Um, I believe. But anyway, and the resilience to put yourself in that position, the confidence to put yourself in that position, can only come out of the hope that there is actually a truth to be discovered, and that it's not just a technology, but it's higher than a technology. That we don't want to rely on Metis, the Titan. We would rather have Pallas Athena as the I'm probably going to talk weirdly here, using the Greek mythology or whatever, but I mean, yeah, in some sense, the purpose of the Greek mythology is not the reconciliation with Zeus, but it is in the pantheon. Hmm, yeah, it's somewhat strange because in some sense the actual integration, the symbol of the integration within the pantheon, the symbol of the proper understanding, is Hermes, the messenger. Um, anyway, in some sense, the Greek pantheon is really a model of all the problems of all the spiritual sort of decadences and hubrises, and in some sense it is a very broad allegory of a meta Tower of Babel, which in some sense I would say it served quite well, I think, as an early sort of cognitive functions analysis. If you can understand that the elements in the pantheon were like cognitive functions, each of them. Zeus is like Fi. Anyway, that model only gives you 8, but anyway, this gets. I'm kind of rambling too badly now, but those kinds of analogies end up not being helpful. But I mean, the actual myths themselves, in particular, um, Sisyphus and his stone being rolled up the hill. I mean, that famously was something that Nietzsche explored. Um, it's something of the paradigm of science itself, of materialism and determinism. All reasoning in the application, element of agents engaging in reality, is essentially reducible to Sisyphus. I'm just trying to think, who was the other guy who was cursed? I don't know if it was also Sisyphus, or if it was in Dante's Inferno, Sisyphus was, or if it was somebody else. Wow, I'm so ignorant. But the guy who, the word, I can't even remember the word. There's an English word that was created, tantalum, tantalus, tantalizing. Yeah, we get the word tantalizing from, I believe, Tantalus. I might be getting the name wrong, but Tantalus, I think, in the divine, what was it called? The Divine Comedy. I can't remember. The book that Dante's Inferno, the movie, is based on, but the book, I believe, is the Divine Comedy. Um, I can't remember, but Tantalus is in one of the circles of hell, I believe, unless this is also another Greek myth. And there is a fruit tree that overhangs overhead, And when he reaches up to the fruit, the branch of the tree is sort of blown away to be out of his reach. So he can't reach for the fruit above his head. And he's up to his neck in water. And if he stoops down to slake his thirst and to drink from the water recedes. And this was his punishment, I believe, for the myth in which I think he shaved all the fur off of a satyr. I'm probably not saying that right, but a half man, half goat, who was this kind of natural beast or something like that, and he shaved all of his fur off to shame him for being sort of half a beast or something like that, and to reveal the nakedness of his half bestial form. And then, no wait, I can't remember. It's quite a long story of Tantalus. I think he dined with the gods, and he showed them up, because at his dining table he fed to the gods, I think one of his own children or something like that. So he made them all cannibals or partakers of human flesh. He sacrificed one of his own children and fed them to, in some sense, it's the inversion of Abraham. And so essentially he roped in the gods in their sin, in his sin. I guess you could say that he didn't have anything worthy of entertaining the gods at his dinner table. But it's not about entertainment, it's about actually, he didn't have a fat lamb, or he didn't have a good piece of livestock that he could slay and feed at his feasting dinner table, and he instead used his own child as what was available, because he was perhaps so starstruck at being surrounded by the gods. And when it was revealed that essentially he killed one of his own children in order to feed his dinner table, he roped in the gods in his own sin, in that sense. It's almost like that. It was almost like that. I don't think that this happened in real life. I think that this happened in the mind of Homer, that already explored this. That this is what happens in the Greek culture all the time. That people steal from their own children in order to feed others at a banquet table. They steal the dignity of their own children. The sadistically edged cannibalism from the family unit and between the family units, because of the head of the household or the and being starstruck and such. That in some sense it's another way of describing the fornication with the whore of Babylon between the great kings and the merchants in Babylon the Great, who are drunk on the wrath of the fornication with the whore. And that this is Tantalus's fate, is that when he tries to slake his thirst or reach for the fruit, he is frustrated in as much as he tries, that his form of trying how he tries is what is sinful within his own disposition. It's not what he's trying for, it's how he tries. His introverted feeling is so undeveloped that he can just allow himself to indulge in a sophisticated form of introverted thinking, and therefore perpetuates the curse of fatherlessness in the world. Anyway, this is a very strange, sort of weird tangential. Uh, anyway, I mean, in some sense, I think a very important aspect here is I would just point people towards listening to the interview between Jordan Peterson and Matthew McConaughey. And that, I think that we in culture and in history are at maybe a crossroads. That are we going to choose to continue to perpetuate the culture, the toxicity of this kind of fatherless idea of dignity, that we can have dignity in a fatherless state, that now, we're even banishing the word father and mother, so as to disguise our own profane hollowness and nihilistic compartmentalized amoralism, so that we can disguise from ourselves our many branched, warring inconsistency and self-contradiction, that other people must be on trial and be scapegoated for the inconsistency that we cannot even self-reflect upon as we banish the words, so that we can escape. Being convicted for the use of our disgusting narrative simplifications. And I mean, I'll just say that we need conventions. Without some universal conventions or something like that, I mean, that is literally to say that we can't have words. The idea that words are somehow functionally derived or something like that. Words will always be ambiguous labels, but that doesn't mean to lean into the ambiguity of them. It is to watch vigilantly and to hold onto the conventionality of the words, because otherwise we're just always running away and reinventing the same problem with just a new set of words, leaving what in their wake? And it's never deconstructing properly and thoroughly when it pretends to deconstruct. It fudges, it stops halfway, and then it says, well, that's good enough, and then it moves on to the next thing that needs to be supposedly deconstructed according to the fucking narrative. This is embarrassing. Watching people who justify this under some generalized sociological reduction of some kind of, well, this is my ecology of phenomenological self-inquiry. one that will not burden the word justification, substantiation, understanding. Oh, it's all just tentative and metafluid. Oh, I'll just stay in my lane, it's collective sense making. I'll say as well, it's the degree to which people do use metas, that is a secret that will eventually have to render some kind of judgment. And that judgment will always cut both ways, so you have to be very careful that when you judge, you don't marginalize yourself into obscure I have to be careful here because I have to use moral language. Because it's not about equilibrium or balancing, it's about qualitative principles. It's about justice at a high level, not at some kind of distributed level of relatability. It's not about a lowest common denominator, it's actually about a highest common denominator. This is an addendum to the recording, so I just thought, after sleeping on it, there are certain issues that I should probably address, that I did touch on that probably need to be cleaned up a bit. But it was interesting as well. One of the things which Evan brought up in his talk, between sutra and tantra, or tantric ways of growing. Okay, so I'm just going to blanketly talk about my model. I guess I think what's the problem with Evan's virtualism is that basically it says that basically we, to put it in the language of Kegan stages, is the idea, the false idea that we can have a kind of common ground, a common reality within which I actually think is a Kegan stage 2 type of sharing of a shared base reality, that we can kind of rope each other into being compatible with each of our Kegan stage 2s. That there's an objective reality about Kegan stage 2, that we can all kind of be on the same platform. And based on that, uh, fundamentally what's happening is that Kegan stage 4 is not actually being properly stabilized, and there is no way to get from Kegan stage 4 to stage 5 without making properly the transition between Kegan stage 3 to Kegan stage 4, which is basically being fudged. Because in some sense, that transition between Kegan stage 3 and a stable Kegan stage 4 is where you actually get commonality, is where you actually get, let's say, a model of a faith that can be shared by, in some sense, working, the bell tolls for thee, working on yourself. And in some sense, this is what I'm trying to touch on in terms of the Tantra sort of thing. So Evan tries to emphasize, that essentially, because we're mixing and matching so much, we're not actually doing anything that's kind of like a sutra. We're doing something that's more tantric in terms of the growth, and in some sense I think that that is emblematic more of the transition from Kegan stage 3 to Kegan stage 4. Now, my reading here is that I agree with Evan that Tantra is in some sense, especially within the people that Evan is pitching this talk to, the tantric model makes more sense. But I just want to go more deeply into that, because I do think that in some sense there isn't such a clear-cut distinction between tantra and sutra, that essentially if you are going to do it in a more tantric kind of environment, or a more tantric kind of sangha or something like that, you can't in some sense dispense with sutra. And I mean, maybe what I'm saying is maybe just because my semantics is weak or whatever, but in some sense I do think that the tantric path means that you have to be responsible for your own development of a sutra yourself. So in some sense you have to recover or collect within yourself some kind of semblance of a sutra. So that, I think, is somewhat being missed in maybe if you sort of make this harsh dichotomy between sutra and tantra, that the tantra and tantric, how you weave in some sense, if you don't see the pattern that you have woven, and in some sense that recognition of that requires some kind of sutric perspective about it. And so if you don't think that is a stable, if there is a stable measure, if there's no objective morality to judge that, I mean, I know the word objective here is a bit strange, but this is my general sort of thesis, is that the only common ground that we can ever get to is not through Kegan stage 2, that is just going to be fudged as a narrative, and that narrative is going to somewhat carry a shadow over Kegan stage 3, which is the unconsciousness, I would say, and which then that shadow is then inherited by a never stabilized Kegan stage 4. So that's my reading of it. That essentially, and I am more on the tantric side of things myself, but I somewhat know. So I mean, in some sense, you see, this is the problem: is that whenever one communicates, one can, in some sense, only communicate via sutra, and the idea that you can communicate tantrically, although you can, is fundamentally inane and profane in some sense to never having a stable Kegan stage 4, because you never have a grasp of it, you never have a bearing of it. It's always tentative, it's always amorphous, it's always, in some sense, you're stuck in this kind of, you're under somebody else's sort of thematic metis or something like that. So, and I mean, maybe Evan has erected that puzzle box within this, that you kind of have to, you have to, in your personal phenomenological self-inquiry, you have to construct that. And maybe then it's not useful for me to kind of give this kind of outline and model, perhaps, as a guru, because you have to become your own guru in some sense within the tantric. That's the point of the tantric thing. You have to sort of become your own guru, but that's very dangerous as well, because if you just are enlightened yourself, and you can only tolerate other people who are enlightened in a similar enough narrative, but you don't actually share the same edifice, because it's not something that you can communicate about, because it's essentially, it's a commonality that is grounded in Kegan stage 2, because it's fudged, quite frankly. And then you basically have to, essentially it has to be a game that you're playing. In Kegan stage 4, you're never going to have a stabilized Kegan stage 4. So I do think that maybe Evan's model is fundamentally different to mine. because he does say things that he thinks that Kegan stage 4 should be fluid. And I think that no, it's Kegan stage 5 that is fluid. It's not Kegan stage 4 needs to be static. That's how it is stabilized. And if it's not static, then you're stuck in Kegan stage 4 essentially, and you've got a narrative around that, and you're fundamentally projecting that narrative, and you're stuck in a kind of metis, warfare. You haven't even progressed down to Zeus. You're still on the level of the Titans, of the War of the Titans, essentially. Um, but if I can say that in some sense, the reason why I was going into Tantalus and how he's depicted in the Divine Comedy is that in some sense, Tantalus is an archetype of the worldly father, the father of the world, um, or the father of material reality, or something like that. And in some sense, we are all the victim of our natural fathers, of our biological fathers, in some sense orphaning us, or in some sense feeding our flesh to the gods. Uh, in Kegan stage 2, and if and in some sense this was embodied by Abraham, who actually went through the motion of the token of sacrificing his son to God, to a monotheistic God, and then stopping, and then reversing that after being the father that orphans the son as a ritual that the son participated in with his eyes open, so that the son survived and lived with that experience. That was an embodied experience. And I would argue that that is the spiritual lineage of a different kind of father that is not the same father as Tantalus, who was tantalized in his effort to obtain value, a higher value, that he sacrificed his own son to feed to the gods. Um, and then dirty those higher values by his lower supplication. So he kind of, Tantalus never transcended his own worship of value, his own idolization of values themselves. You can turn values into an idolatry, essentially, into a narrative. And so, the meta fluidity of Kegan stage 4 is achieved by a kind of solid state. I don't want to say that it's static. I think it's better to call it a solid state. Anyway, these are all somewhat metaphors, and they only make sense if you join in the common ground of the Kegan stage 4, as it were, and you participate on that level, and you get a taste of it, and you see how it can be fashioned within yourself, how you can inculcate that, or something like that. and that I think is the function of the Sangha. Uh, and I do think I am more partial to the sort of the tantric Sangha, but I do think that people have to grow in their personal responsibility for their own development of their own sutra, that essentially they can't just be part of this collective tapestry that they have a tantric niche in or something like that. And it's not easy for every type of person to communicate to every type of other type of person, uh, in terms of the kind of the sutra sort of element there that I'm trying to sort of derive at. Um, I would say in my mystery school tradition, which is essentially Christianity, this I think it has to do with the white stone and the name written on the white stone that only you can read. That that there is something to that, but that is also, I would say, deeply connected with Kegan stage 5, which is in some sense the settlement between Kegan stage 2 and Kegan stage 3, which is a kind of languishing, you know, you in some sense you have to have a lot of clean run throughs before you actually settle the other stages, after entering Kegan stage 5. And in some sense, if you, and again, if you, anyway, I mean, so yeah, there's, but yeah, I mean, but essentially, if Kegan stage 2 is objectively shared with other people instead of subjectively given but not received. I mean, this is there's a fundamental sort of asymmetry here, that is the source of your own internal motivation, and you can give of it to other people, but the world cannot receive it, but with discerning eyes or whatever, with the shared edifice in Kegan stage 4, with some kind of communion on that level in terms of a shared phenomenological world, which is the only sort of stability there is in the entire system. There really has to be quite a finely tuned internal orchestrated integration before these things start to somewhat emerge. But yeah, I mean, if I sort of talk further about this, I'm going to get specifically perhaps into character assassination, and I don't want to go there. But in some sense, there is, I think, the the failing of many spiritual paths that do not inculcate properly, let's say, conviction around the bridge between Kegan stage 3 and Kegan stage 4. And when the idea of conviction goes out the window, you will always get a fundamentally misshapen Kegan stage 4. You will not have, you'll have a Kegan stage 4 that cannot bear the meaning of the word or the term's justification, authority. You know, so somehow, semantically, you've got such a kind of compartmentalization of this meta fluidity that certain words, certain concepts, essentially have to be unthought, even, and or you can shift this around in kind of a weird sort of epistemological matrix or an ontological narrative or something like that. That suddenly, oh well, you're not a thinker, but you're allowed to have thoughts or something like that, but you're not a thinker of thoughts, so you end up having to dissolve quite strangely a sense of boundaries of responsibility, even have to kind of become nebulous in order to take the weight of a narrative, in which we all have the same objective reality below the phenomenological level of a personal phenomenological self-inquiry. Like certain categories of personality or personal just become part of a narrative of transpersonal necessity because of the equal yoke of fear and sort of trembling in well, there's no alternative, so we have to adopt this particular narrative so that we can kind of grow ourselves within that template or something like that, so that we can be free enough. And I mean, I guess in that context, well, I mean, I'll just be a glad fly, I guess. That's all I sort of can be. But I do think that essentially it suffers from this idea that, well, the collective is the source of moral consideration, and it is fundamentally, let's say, plugged into some kind of evolutionary scientific narrative materialism that, well, the tribe and the group is the source, in fact, of the individual, and the individual understanding does not have sovereignty or does not have dignity without the group confirming that or something like that. And you end up with values which are themselves a kind of nebulous rationalization of some kind of ontological narrative. And either way, you end up basically without an objective morality or without an objective anything, but a kind of subjective, well, you have to go along to get along, to just some kind of enforced credo or something like that, which is somewhat hidden in something that seems innocuous, which is that, okay, well, scientific materialism is the base level, is the ground floor. Because everything is, let's say, grounded in that linchpin on that platform, that is the starting point. I mean, I would argue that is a toxic holdover of Kegan stage 2, that there isn't enough of a I mean, it's interesting. Or in the Christian sort of mystical tradition that I would say I belong, there is a baptism by water and there's a baptism by fire. And the fire is, in some sense, the spirit. And the water is symbolic of, I would say, the unconscious side of the mind of Kegan stage 3. Also, the water that archetypally flooded the world when the world was so wicked in its soulful knowledge, in its knowledge of the soul. The water is like a water is always in a body, but there is a spiritual father that can divide the waters from the waters. This is the power of the spirit. This is the power of the baptism by fire. But in some sense, you don't even get that far unless you let go of the pretension that there is some kind of canonical source of external locus of control, external source of authority, because then otherwise you can never get into the proper, even phenomenological inquiry and exploration of the soul itself, because the soul is just a kind of is a pale emergent phenomenological projection or hologram from some kind of base external authority, some kind of outside objective medium or something like that. And where did this ever come from? I mean, how did this appear in the conscious mind? Oh, was it just, did the God of science just magically help us evolve a way that we could at least be imprinted with the God of the world in our mind? I mean, it's the level of magical thinking that you actually need in order to stabilize the materialistic dogma, the materialistic scientific narrative, which is itself, completely devoid of deductive reasoning. I mean, science does not verify anything. It's a methodological. Anyway, it's an argument. I mean, you can make an argument for science, and then you can get into counter argument, and then you can have an infernal argument that has no resolution. Well done. Or you can point out the hard skeptical false dilemma that it's premised on, that it even needs in order it won't even talk to you unless you believe in the false dilemma. That's how it protects its own and it insulates its own ignorance and the love of its own darkness. That it loves to not understand. It prays for the day that there'll be an artificial intelligence that says, yes, your narrative is correct, and you can't understand it because I'm more intelligent as an AI than you are. I mean, that's the fulfillment of that, is Superman, is Krypton, is Brainiac. I mean, we have people that have made comic books are more intelligent than people in white lab coats, are more wise, have already seen the end of that Greek tragedy. Falling in love with your own reflection in a body of water, in the surface of a body of water. But you have to remember the darkness is on the face of the deep. We misinterpret the deepness for darkness that is reflected back at us. And instead of plumbing the depths, and you think just because you can make the body of water still, that somehow you have a mastery over it. All of this is essentially false technology. People have gotten a taste of technology and they think that means that there's something dignified about their soul. The hubris, the pride, this is all kegan stage 2 stuff. And in some sense, it's just because people want to respect their natural fathers, their biological fathers, or their biological mothers, or their biological kin. This is usually the biggest stumbling block that people have, is that they will prefer the sympathy. They won't go the route of the Stoic. Which is even reflected in the Christian scriptures. Jesus says, as a necessary condition for discipleship, you should hate your mother and your father and your brother and your sister and even your own life just to be worthy to be a disciple. That does not sufficiently make you a disciple. That makes you worthy, just worthy to be a disciple. It's a necessary condition, not a sufficient condition, and that's just one of the sort of the starting blocks to that path. And another one would be that there is actually something to be found in the journey. Otherwise, you're not even looking. You were never on the path. I'm somewhat quoting from Mark Passio. But yeah, I would really commend to people to listen to the Mark Passio 7 Principles of Hermeticism. It's a good enough secular model of, I think, at least some categories that are needed. I'm just trying to see how I can tie that into cognitive functions. But yeah, I think if you take all the categories that Mark Passio is talking about, and you try to sort of systemize that within cognitive functions, then you get a way in which that your phenomenology can eclipse, so-called things about reality and the mind. But yeah, I guess just to re-emphasize the point that I've been going on is that essentially detachment from kegan stage 2, which I think is a necessary requirement, will essentially lead to establishing a Tower of Babel. And you do need to fail at establishing a Tower of Babel. You need, I think, some sense to go through that in order to live in its shadow, because in some sense, there's a mystery about it that at some point, in the very end, mysteries need to be solved. But in Kegan stage 3, it's a mystery. And in some sense, you need to know the solution to mystery. That's why you're dealing with the mysteries, that you need to know general solutions to mysteries. And then you can even use them perhaps to particularly help you to detach from Kegan stage 2 because of... but to some extent you can also use the shadow of the Tower of Babel to protect yourself until you grow a kind of personal responsibility around not getting into the new technological fad, the new technological craze. I don't want to make that like a blanket prescription. I just mean that you don't end up building another Tower of Babel, essentially. That perhaps you can get on the level of communicating as to collectivizing all the ways in which, Towers of Babels realistically corrupt the visions of people in some sense. And, in some way, the real resolution of that is somewhat Sisyphus, rolling the boulder up the hill and then it just goes down again, and then rolling it up the hill and it just goes down again. And that suffering only becomes redeemed when you, in some sense, choose your suffering because of the transcendent, emergent truth about it, which is a personal truth in some sense, but that personal truth can have from its enlightened subjectivity, can have an objective morality. But that objective morality is not imported from the outside. It's exported to the outside, from the inside, where the truth is, on the inside of Kegan stage 4, which is a solid state. Otherwise it can't be true. It can't be. And that is a huge thing to say. I mean, I realize how that sounds. And in some sense that's why sutras exist in some sense. Because, unless you at least frame your search within these parameters, we're going to end up creating alternative conventional language games that are going to just invalidate each other or cut each other, or maybe each of them can be correct within our individual psychology, but collectively we won't be able to accommodate each other, or something like that. We won't be able to have a shared metafluidity in our Kegan stage 4 personal culture, that we can each have a personal culture that can fit in with other people's personal cultures, and that we can say that we have the same spiritual culture, that our spirits are brethren. But if you already have a model for how you want to deploy that at scale on society, and have a kind of everyone is a Kegan stage 4 based on some precepts or based on some dogmatic orthodoxy or something like that. I mean, you're just trying to make another sort of Napoleonic French Nazi type fascist. You're going to have a disgusting form of legal system. Probably you're going to have inquisitors. You're going to have, I mean, who knows? It's and it's only going to be justifiable by sort of saying, well, we've got these Kegan stage 2 objective reality, and now we've got a scientific language of objective morality, and so we are the thought police, we are the language police. I don't think there's going to be a way around that, not to mention the uncomfortable fact that people can't just be born into Kegan stage 4, they have to grow up. It's completely so you're going to end up creating a society that is going to treat people that are like they're at Kegan stage 4 when they're not at Kegan stage 4. And the pedagogical work of this, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I'm going around in circles maybe. But anyway, I guess I'm somewhat exploring the issue. But I mean, just to put it explicitly, in Kegan stage 4, how you reach that solid state is what I would call the crucifixion, the technology of the crucifixion. Because there is an emergent missing of the mark because of the inherited deficiencies in our own structure. But the ego is innocent of those structures, because the ego is just the latest chain of stage of your consciousness. It's not its fault that Kegan stage 2 is toxic as fuck. It's not its fault that Kegan stage 2 wants to have an objective paradigm. It's not the ego's fault, but the ego has to sit with the mismatch, with the aftermath. And then are we really going to say, well, we just need to make a world in which we all put up with each other's iniquities, that we give each other a wide berth, and we'll just throw away the words justification, we'll throw away the words understanding. Our understanding will be understand to stay in your lane. You have a piece of the puzzle. You can't convict other people. You can't speak of an objective morality. Those will be taboo. The objective morality will belong to the collective, and you will be a cog. And we'll have certain armchair philosophers. And, we won't be convincing to one another. We won't be persuasive. Our persuasion will not be based on a kind of objective morality. It'll just be it'll be sort of wasted on a kind of semantic metis game. will have the rule of man, will be as gods, or some bullshit like that. Law will have no sanctity as being part of the commons. You know, this is the problem when you sort of, I mean, in some sense, I do think it's hidden in Evan's narrative, and the idea that, okay, well, science is an objective sort of thing, is a solid paradigm that can't be disagreed. I mean, that I think is everything poisonous is somewhat in the line of that. You know, there are lots of forms of corruption, and one of them, which is the worst, is when you actually do offer some form of love, but it comes with deceptiveness, it comes with deceit, it produces a lie. The love comes at the cost of the truth. The love comes at the cost of willfully lying, and then you abuse the language, and then you end up like Nazi society, essentially, where everything just culturally dissipates. I mean, I'm talking about things that people don't have a common reality on. I mean, this will sound just like a theory, but I mean, as someone who is studied personality his whole life, and personality theory, developed personality theory, and now I'm going to sound like a complete crackpot. I mean, I would say I have been personally involved in all of the luminary leading figures of personality theory. Oh, that's embarrassing that I can't even remember her name. I'm not even talking about MBTI. I'm talking about the actual field. I'm talking about, wow, this is so embarrassing. I can't remember her name. Sam Vaknin, and the woman who, with me, developed the model of dialectical behavior therapy. I guess that sounds. I mean, obviously, she did all the actual work, and I mean, we wouldn't have been able to work out these things together without her great knowledge. I mean, so I mean, in some sense, in consultation. You could say, I guess, is also related to Ken Wilber, tangentially. I mean, in some sense, you know. So I've always had these fractious dealings with intellectuals where I would go with them, and then I would tell them why their system breaks down at a certain point, and then, you know, people don't want to break their own models, essentially. And in some sense, they're not necessarily wrong for not wanting to break their own models, because they can't find the next peg, they can't find the next sort of frame to hang it around, or something like that. And science is such a corrupted field that it needs something rather than nothing. Anyway, I'm really blathering quite a bit, but and trying to improve the structure of psychology, I mean, is very is fraught with danger. You know, when you're dealing with a field of knowledge which is so pathetic and weak and essentially devoid of all integrity, in that, it tries to supplicate itself to the scientific method, and psychology can never be a science effectively. It can only be a kind of philosophically premised sort of thing. I mean, if you don't even understand the intellectual defects of the scientific method, you really should not be in theoretical psychology. It's but anyway, sorry. This is probably just sounds strange, but and in some sense, I guess what I'm describing is exactly the fundamental problem with Ken Wilber's model as well, is that he was essentially trying to ground it in a Kegan stage 2 objective matrix on some level, that it is reducible to that. I mean, you see, this is the problem, is that you can kind of have your cake and eat it once you've kind of woven the trickery into the structure. Um, Although I do think Mark Manson's critique of Ken Wilber is by far the most brilliant, and comprehensive and intellectually palpable. So anyway, I'd just point to that. Anyway, I've going all over the place, not talking about anything and talking about everything. Yeah, so I mean, I guess just the 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 missing sutra, I would just say, should be part of the project of a tantric style of spiritual growth and engagement. Um, Otherwise, it's not going to grow in wisdom. It's just going to grow in metis and trickery. Um, and in some sense, you're just going to become a more sort of compartmentalized, nihilistic, amoral Kegan stage 4.5. But in some sense, I think that might. In some sense, the horrible thing is that although I can see that from the outside, um, it does become manifest to the people themselves, but usually it takes them 20 years of running the gauntlet, of going through the mill, essentially, of seeing that about themselves. If they do actually embody it in practice, then you get the sort of the Osho commune. You just see how, they don't want to do anything. They don't want to be productive. They don't want to actually sustain themselves, because if they did that, they would be giving up their power of imagination as to their sense of this weird kind of entitlement, this weird kind of self-importance, this weird kind of spiritual status that they've just bestowed on themselves as a category or as a group. But as soon as that they would actually have to get into some form of actually organizing, then the deficiency in the royal we, what should we do about it? The problems of leadership, the problems of everything, and you realize that the world is not a wicked place because of some people. It's a wicked place in some sense because of everyone's lack of responsibility as individuals. And in some sense, I do think you have to bootstrap yourself. I mean, I'll blame myself for not being more persuasive and convincing at being able to reframe people. But at some point, I might also, maybe I'm looking in the wrong place, so I'll blame myself for that, and I'll go look somewhere else. In some sense, why don't I just build it then? Or build the evidence, if I so wish to be convincing to certain people. And the only thing that would stop me from that is, let's say, my personal, transpersonal faith that tells me, don't go after soggy toast. And there's obviously something in myself that is making me prone to this kind of desperation. So maybe I should discharge that instead. I know I don't want to confuse this recording with... I need to make another recording about a model, an optimized model of personality and self-actualization and reaching Kegan stage 5, but through all the let's say, a model of development and a model of essentially all the different stumbling blocks, but also and I can self-reflect there probably in terms of my own sort of therapy that I've been unlocking and such. Only recently I would say that I've really gotten a handle on the different ways in which the toxicity within the false ego complex manifests within the various Kegan stages and how they actually interrelate between those Kegan stages, because I finally did the work of rereading Revelations, or actually not the whole of Revelations, just from chapter 16 onwards, because I think that that's where that was the missing piece of the puzzle, was the last bit of Revelations, because the first bit of Revelations, I think, that I had already sort of have been dealing with that. That has been my prime model of understanding the lay of the land, as it were. But there certainly were some misstarts, because I think I did actually enter Kegan stage 5, but it was very aberrative. But I needed to do that in order to identify the different parts of my cognitive anatomy. Or at least to fully understand the crucifixion. So that was, I would say, let's say, a dry run. Anyway, really I'm babbling now.